With me today is my friend Josh Malkin from the ACLU of South Carolina. Josh, welcome.
Thanks, Sam. Great to be here.
Of course. And Josh is the advocacy director for the ACLU. So we'll let him explain a little bit about what that means and how that relates to our topic today, which is the book regulations that just went into effect at the state level from Superintendent Ellen Weaver. But I also want to just make sure that everybody is aware who hasn't heard from Josh before, that he is always the realist in the room. Some might view me as the optimist in the room. Josh is always the one who keeps it really real. So we're going to expect him to keep it really real with us today. But at the end, I'm going to make sure that we end on a high note because everyone loves hearing Josh say something optimistic and carry them through the rest of the day. So Josh, before we start, explain to us a little bit about what being the advocacy director for the ACLU of South Carolina means and some of the work that you do.
Gladly. The Advocacy Department at the ACLU of South Carolina has two missions. One is to bring information from the State House out to folks in local communities so they can know what their elected officials are doing, what decisions they are making, allegedly on behalf of their constituents, so that folks can be informed and advocate as they feel comfortable doing. And the flip side of that is we love being with local communities as they fight for and against local decisions being made that either infringe upon or expand civil rights and civil liberties for South Carolinians.
So Josh, really tough week in South Carolina when it comes to looking at the freedom to read and academic freedom in our state. This week, we saw Ellen Weaver's book review regulations go into effect automatically without proper protocol. Can you walk us through what the regulations are doing and how come they got to just go into effect without anything taking place?
I can, and I promise I'm not trying to hijack this interview, but I have this new kick. So I feel, a lot of us in this movement who are pro books and pro academic freedom, I think that we often understandably feel what we are fighting against, right? We are fighting against these angry, often prejudiced mobs of censorship. And I think it's really important that we remember to be pro-educator. I think a lot of folks out there are pro-educator, and they just don't realize that we need to be more vocal. Now more than ever, we know that our educators are hearing this really damaging, harmful, insulting language that undermines their professionalism and their devotion as public servants. So especially for folks who are like, well, what is advocacy? How can I advocate? A very good way to start your advocacy journey is to ensure that you're expressing your thanks and your gratitude to our incredible public educators, and just make it known to our decision makers that our public educators deserve all of our respect. We have, and you will have to cut me off, I promise you, because I can go on.
I would be remiss if I didn't highlight the fact that both Josh and I are former educators now in the advocacy realm, right? So when we talk about being pro educators, it comes from a little bit of a place of bias, but also a deep understanding and appreciation of all of the work that public school teachers and staff and support teams do because we have seen it firsthand. So I felt like if I didn't call that out, we would be missing part of the story here.
Yeah. And I don't know about you, but I left after 5 years because it was too hard, right? And then I went to law school, which was significantly easier. And now the job I have now, which is awful and terrible a lot of days, is still easier than being an educator.
Yes, I say quite frequently that my job in advocacy at the State House is less stressful and takes less of a toll on my mental health than it was in my 6 years as a public school teacher. And I think if that doesn't really highlight the crisis that public education is in right now, I don't know that anything will. I have said that to legislators, to their face, working with you face to face on these issues that I know you and I don't agree on, but thank you for speaking with me about them anyway. I would still rather do this than be in a public school setting right now. So yeah, the fact that we are at this point is really disturbing.
Yeah. And one more, and then I'll stop and answer your actual question. I will just say that being an educator by itself is heroic, right? Like that waking up every day and educating a room full of students who are widely different levels and with widely different needs is like heroism in my perspective. But I also just want to, like, in this moment, uplift our librarians, right? And that job by itself is heroic. But we actually have some, like, the nation's leading experts when it comes to advocating for academic freedom. So they are very much with me this morning. And if you hear me, bring my normal, if not a heightened rage this morning, I am certainly bringing them with me to this interview. But on to the question at hand: how did these regulations go into effect without any actual vetting? So I will say the normal regulatory process is extremely opaque. It is a 3-page flowchart that people who have been around the State House for decades have a hard time following.
Yes.
Normally,
yes, that flowchart was probably the opposite of helpful. If you need a 3-page flowchart to explain something,
right.
You're doing something wrong. Yeah.
Right. And normally what happens is at the end of session, there's something called the sign and die resolution. It's kind of the agreement that the two chambers reach saying, okay, normal session is over. This is what we agree to work on during the summer months. And typically the sign and die resolution includes language saying that the clock on regulations stops during, the summer months. So regulations typically have 120 days before they de facto go into effect. But the 120-day clock typically stops when they're not in, every day January through May session. And that phrase, we believe inadvertently, was left out. So because the clock did not stop, the regulation went into effect without the full House debating the regulation, without any member of the Senate debating the regulation. And I think we had a lot of elected officials, especially some leading senators, who read the regulation, realized how poorly and sloppily drafted it was, and the scope of consequences that would come from it, and they opposed it. And I think that if we were if that phrase had been included in sine die, I think that there would have been changes made to the regulation, because there will certainly be, even for, I tend to disagree with book banning principally because it's authoritarian control over other people. But even for the folks who have, very narrow concerns about, a few books, this is not that. This is American classics. These are AP books. These are children's books about potty training, like Everybody Poops. They weren't drafted well. And, those concerns were raised to the superintendent. They were raised to elected officials when constituents reached out. It's disappointing it went down this way. There were opportunities for it to not. So I'm certainly disappointed that we are here today. I want to, me, I'm not one for much optimism, but I hope that when our legislature comes back next year, they will do what they can to, let kids in South Carolina read.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, the fact that only one of our two chambers even started discussing these regulations before sine die in a meaningful way. So these regulations went into effect without the full vetting of both of our chambers. It was almost like the rug pulled out from under the Senate. It felt like reading some of the quotes from some of the senators and having conversations with some of the senators that they were really almost caught off guard by the loophole in the language. And they were upset about it because there's a process for a reason. Things need to be vetted. Things need to go through proper protocol. There's a reason that the Senate had chosen not to spend the time yet reviewing those regulations. They wanted to be intentional in looking them through and thoughtful in what they recommended back to the State Department of Education, because the General Assembly can't amend regulations, but they can send them back, right? And they can say, we want you to specifically look at this section. This feels a little vague. This feels a little problematic, right? So the fact that one entire chamber of our General Assembly did not have the opportunity to do that, and these regulations went into effect, is highly problematic. But even more problematic is the regulations themselves, right? So the piece to me that really is a concern that I want to make sure that people understand, because I'm not sure that they do, is that a person who puts in a book challenge at a local school level can therefore then appeal to the state if they are unhappy. So if their local school board says, hey, we didn't see a problem with these books when they went through proper review, we're putting them back on the shelves for students to have access to, the ones who put in that challenge can appeal to the state, and whatever the state decides then goes into effect for every school district across South Carolina. So now we're having these handful of book banners that we know there aren't very many of, right? We know in Beaufort County, 2 people challenged 97 books. We know in the upstate, it's just a 1 or 2 or small handful of people. We know in York and in Horry, right? Because you've been there, you've been at these school board meetings. Now, these very minor percentages of our population are getting a say for what children across our state can access in regards to books. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. To raise another point that I think is often left out of this conversation is like due process, right? So books being on shelves do not infringe on your parental rights. If you're out there talking about parental rights, you probably don't even know like what the law around parental rights says, but you've actually abandoned the language because you realize how hypocritical you're being, saying that your parental rights means you control books for all parents. So if someone is putting a book on a shelf, no one is infringing on your rights. When you demand successfully that a book be taken off a shelf, it's very possible you are infringing on somebody else's parental rights or a student's First Amendment right to access information, right? Book banners are stripping rights away. So the fact that the parents and the students who are having their rights stripped away don't have any opportunity to appeal that decision is problematic, right? The due process is asymmetrical in a way that hands so much more power to the authoritarians and the censors in the room.
Right. It favors the book banners because
100%.
it gives all of the power to the people who are challenging the books and none of the power to the people who are saying, hey, what about my rights? What about my ability to say what my kid has access to in their school library? Like in Beaufort County, they took down a book that had to do with a school shooting because the topic was too mature, right? Like as a parent, that's problematic to me because that's a reality that my children might face in public schools in this state and in this nation. So I should have the right to appeal the fact that that book was taken down, but that's not the way that these policies have been written. And therefore now I'm stuck trying to utilize our public libraries and my personal means to get books to my children, right? If I'm buying them at the bookstore or whatever the case may be. But now we're also seeing them attacking what's in public libraries. And now it's becoming this cycle, right? Mary Foster and I talked about like, at first they were like, oh, go to the public library. It's going to be fine. We're not banning your books. But now they're also going after the public library. So it's like, we see what you're doing. This isn't as clever or as savvy as you think it is. And now I guess my concern is that there's going to be like some like, and I hate to use the term conspiracy theory. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but there's going to be some collusion between certain school boards and the state to say, hey, can we appeal this up to the state level and impact everybody else? We know that there are Moms for Liberty controlled school boards across our state in Charleston, in York County, in Greenville, and in Anderson, right? We've seen these extreme school boards take the side of the book banners. And now I feel like we're empowering and emboldening people to take rights away from parents and take rights away from students in a way that is not only unconstitutional, but the antithesis of the conservative movement, right? Like we talk about what being conservative means and small government and home rule, and this completely supersedes all of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is rights for me and not rights for thee. It seems to be the only consistent principle I have found amongst the conservative movement.
Yeah. And so you were at the state school board meeting where there was public comment given about these regulations back in like November, right? This has been a while. So can you give us, for those of us who weren't in the room that day, kind of what the vibe was? I know they cut off public comment after 10 people and they had 5 who supported the regulations and 5 who didn't, but that room was full. What was the vibe of that room? Give us an idea of like what the vibe across the state is when you go to these school board meetings to really emphasize which side is the majority of the support on here.
Yeah, I will say it varies by locality, but pretty much everywhere I've been, there has been, the folks trying to protect democracy, trying to protect children's access to books are the majority. Not always the case amongst decision makers, which gets problematic. But at that State Board of Ed meeting, yeah, I mean, everyone in favor of the regulation, for the most part, or a large number of them, came from the same family and like the same church, right? Like the rhetoric is very, very often religious, talking about God, talking about immorality. It's a religious tenor, which is not surprising considering we just heard our superintendent of education give a speech at the Heritage Foundation, praising the merit and value of overtly Christian education. So these folks, whether they know it or not, and I think our superintendent probably does, are puppets, if not players, in the larger movement to dismantle public education. I think book banning generally, the book banning movement, the censorship movement, these folks, again, knowingly or unknowingly, have been deputized in the fight to dismantle public ed. Because as we're already seeing, if you're an educator and you're working 14, 16-hour days to do your best by all of your students, and what you're hearing is you're all of these terrible things, yeah, I completely understand if you leave the job. So then the folks who don't want public ed can say, look, our public ed system is broken. We helped to do it, but it's broken. We can't staff our schools. We need an alternative. And the alternative is the dismantling of public ed for an even less equitable system where, religious evangelicals can make sure that their children truly are indoctrinated during the normal school day.
Absolutely. Well, Josh, I'm going to make you end on something positive here because that's what I do. Tell me what you're holding on to, how we can potentially, I don't want to say overturn these regulations. I think that ship has sailed, but what are people who are in this fight with you, what can they be holding on to today to give them hope moving forward?
Yeah, I'm not going to say names on here. I just know that there are these incredible librarians in the upstate who, at the risk of personal and professional threat and injury, continue to fight for the visibility of all students. They're often what keep me going, knowing that they are doing what they're doing in the roles that they hold. So just know that there are folks out there like you, folks willing to, take time out of their day to defend democracy, to defend the visibility of all students. So please, if you are someone who is watching this, you have begun your advocacy journey, and we at the ACLU are always happy to talk and think through next steps for your advocacy journey.
Absolutely. Yes. If you are listening to this, come on board the Freedom to Read train. We will plug you in to all of the great people that we know wherever you are in the state. Josh, thank you so much for helping me kind of process what has been difficult to process over the last few days or so. And I know that we will be in touch soon about some other thing that is happening in our state because there's always something.
Yeah, we've got to stop meeting like this.
I know. It'll be a good thing at some point in time. We'll be celebrating something fantastic. I know it in my gut. Even if you won't say it out loud, I know it in my gut. Thank you, Josh. I'm Emily Mayer from Breathe Hope Vote through the Arena, South Carolina. Make sure that you subscribe to get all of the content that we are able to put out there with all of these great experts like Josh. And we will be in touch soon. Have a great day, everybody.